Hey guys, in this law we're going to be talking about the Miller's Law. And the Miller's Law is really simple, but it's probably one of the most misunderstood laws that we have in laws of UX based on my opinion. So basically what the law states is that the average person can only keep 7 plus or minus 2 items in their working memory. And I actually just want to say that that's not necessarily the correct way of reading this law. Miller himself was actually dumbfounded, you can say, as to how people actually started interpreting his law. It's not about the magic number 7, and we'll read that in the takeaways. But basically, my rendition of this particular law is that people can't really store a lot of items in their working memory, which is obvious. Everyone is going to have a limited memory. How limited, that's obviously going to depend on the individual itself and his familiarity with the product or whatever thing he's interacting with. So we have to make it easier for them to process and scan through items. So the first takeaway is we have to stop using the magical number 7. Like, okay, people can actually remember 7 items, or let's say 7 plus or minus 2 items. So we need to have, let's say, this much items, or we're justified actually having all of these different items on our screen, which is not the case. We don't have to justify it with that. The second takeaway is organize content into smaller chunks to help users process, understand, and memorize easily. So this basically is the gist of the law, which again I've stated here as well. And the third one is that remember that short-term memory capacity will vary per individual based on their prior knowledge and situational context. Obviously, for a person who's very familiar with an application, it would be second nature for him to actually remember some of the items, maybe even if they're exceeding 7. But for new users, it may be hard. So the point is not to actually rely on the number 7 or anything along those lines. Rather, it's to provide easy ways for people to actually get to the information that they're looking for. So how can we actually do that? We can do that by chunking. And chunking is the core gist of this law that I want you to take. So as an example, we can actually see the phone number example. So phone numbers, imagine if phone numbers weren't really formatted like this, the way that they are formatted right now, rather just in a single line. Not only would it be very hard to memorize, but it would also be very hard to vocalize. So 6295550. So you wouldn't really know where to give the pauses, right? Once you know, and once there's a standard pattern to know how to actually vocalize these numbers, people, even the listeners who you're actually announcing these numbers to, would also be very familiar with what this number is, what the area code is, so on and so forth. And it would be much easier to actually go ahead and memorize them and vocalize them. So the second option is menus. So we can actually see a similar example of chunking in some of the menus that I have here. So as an example of Figma, and obviously you can see some of the examples here as well. We have the alignment options in a separate chunk. We have the tidy option in a separate chunk as well, the pack option separately, and the distribute options separately as well. There is some minor distinction between these two distribute options. So obviously this is talking about spacing while this is not, which is why these are differentiated as well and not necessarily in a single list. So that's really important. And again, if some items, for example, in some cases do not really belong to any other group or chunk, don't forcefully move them to, let's say, a similar chunk. As an example, the tidy up options and the round to pixel options, like some people may be like, hey, these two options don't really belong to some of the other chunks. Why don't we just move them together? And that may be reasonable only and only if these two options actually belong to one another, which they don't. So it's perfectly fine to actually keep them separate instead of combining them. So as an example, if you have two options that are quite related to one another, like undo and redo, then that's perfectly fine. You can do that. Here's an example of the Nike header. Imagine, like, for example, even though they have a lot more than 7 items, and that's perfectly fine. Our purpose is not to use the magical number 7, rather direct the user's attention to what they're actually interested in and the goal that they're willing to accomplish so they can take that forward. So as an example, I am really interested in shoes and I want to buy a Nike shoe or something along those lines. Now imagine all of these shoes, if there was no heading and they were just below this new and feature tab, or maybe the new and feature tab wasn't even there as well and they were just a single list. How would I actually go about searching for these? I would have to read through all of them and actually see, okay, this one is talking about shoes here or whatever. Now, if I'm actually interested in shoes, I don't have to scan all of these items or all of these items or all of these items. I just scan the headings, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I just have 6 headings to scan through. And basically I can just say, okay, there's the category or the chunk that I'm interested in, and then I can start consuming it. So that's really important. Some other examples would be the Amazon product page. Now, I just want you to know that this particular law just does not apply to, let's say, chunks of, let's say, menu items or list items or text, right? It's much more broader than that. You can actually use the Miller's law and chunking to actually chunk different portions of your page in a similar fashion, so it's much more consumable. If I, for example, am interested in related products to AirPods, I can go on the top. If I'm interested in the images, I can go on the left. Similarly, for example, you can see there are various chunks across the page. So the payment thing is on the right, the delivery is also on the right, some of the nuanced details are at the bottom, some of the larger title and obviously some of the relevant information in terms of ratings, so on and so forth, are at the top. And then obviously we have the related section at the top and the images on the left as well. So that's really important. Now here's an example of a blog post or basically some lines of text. Now imagine if we actually had a content like this, it would be very hard to actually scan the headings, the subheadings, the emphasis, so on and so forth. So the Miller's law can actually not only be just applied to, let's say, the list items, the page hierarchy, or the content, but it can also basically be applied to, let's say, your reading experience. So imagine that when you're reading a long blog post and it had no formatting, it would be really hard for you to consume or get to the item that you're really interested in. So imagine I'm actually interested in types. Now I can clearly see the type here, but I don't really know where the type content actually starts here. So there's no heading, there's nothing that actually chunks the relevant content together. So even though this text is less bold and is actually smaller than this text actually is much easier to consume. So these are the things that I actually want you to pay attention to. And note, Miller's law is not just about the number of items or anything along those lines. It's more about chunking items together, especially in terms of UX. So that's going to be pretty much it for this video. Do subscribe, to hit the bell icon, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.